Welcome to Man Plus Studio Daily Drive. On today's podcast, we're going to talk about some sampling basics and why audio sampling might be good for you. Coming up today, we actually will be releasing some video of some sampling of the grand piano on YouTube and kind of sharing with you some basics and some principles behind sampling and basically a how-to guide for audio sampling. Now, first we need to talk about what audio sampling is and, of course, why it might be interesting or viable for you. So let's begin with what audio sampling really is and what it entails. Now, audio sampling, when we talk about actually sampling, we're talking about you actually capturing small snippets of audio and utilizing them for your own purposes. And it could be just to trigger them back as a single sample in a continuous form. So some people like to sample clips from movies. And of course they'll just, capture that clip from a movie, just a little bit of dialogue, and then they'll cue it up and they'll play it back as one piece. And then that could be applied to either a live performance or a recording, or a recorded performance, so something that gets distributed. Of course, there's licensing elements that go into that. But in addition to that, I think the strongest and I think the most powerful element of sampling that you can do and you can begin to do is to begin to capture all of your own unique sounds for the purpose of playing them back in either a rhythmic or a melodic form. And I think that is where the strength of sampling really comes in. To kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about, if we were to sample, let's just say we were to sample a car, and we went around and captured some samples of a car door closing, a car engine starting, the sound of the blinkers, the windshield wipers, and then we take those samples and we cut them up and we put them into what we call a sampling engine, which allows us to play them back. Technically, we could then actually take those samples and build some sort of rhythmic pattern. Now, if we were to do the same thing and we did it with a drum kit and we took a kick sample and a snare sample and a hi-hat sample and we recorded these samples and then we put them on, like the Reason engine I prefer to use because you can load them right into the Kong device. It's basically like an MPC. And of course, if you had an MPC, then technically with your MPC, you could actually mic up and actually capture these samples directly to the pads. And so like with that capturing of the samples, then you can play them back by striking these pads and be able to play back what you captured. Well, in reality, that is exactly what Native Instruments does, and there's a lot of companies that do this, but Native Instruments has to be probably one of the leading, manufacturers of these kinds of samples. And if you were to go onto their website and demo some of their sample packs, you would be able to watch video of them for the most part, showing off these really beautiful, pristine samples. Well, the really interesting part about that is when you create a sampling library like that, technically, if you own the samples, and if either you are the performer of whatever the samples are, or you hire somebody to perform them, and you and arrange some sort of agreement with them, technically you can sell those samples all day. And I think that's where the power behind sampling comes in, is not only building your own unique sampling engine, but also being able to technically, sell these samples yourself. Now, in addition to that, I think it's very, very important for those that are sampling to get an idea of how sampling is going to sound after the sample. And some people like to really cut up and really manipulate their samples. I've been hearing a lot about Serum, which is a piece of software that really does a really good job at really manipulating the sample and morphing it into something a little more along the electronic side. And there's a lot of ways to do that. There's a lot of plugins that you could use to really do that with your sample. And things like the Reason engine has a lot of devices that allow you to cut up your samples in that kind of form. And, so sampling really, gives you the ability to do that. But I think the key really comes down to the basics of sampling and like what are the core elements to how you're going to sample. And I think that the one thing that most people forget when they sample is they'll just take a mic and they'll throw it up to something and they'll sample it. And they'll just say, all right, here's my sample, and they move on. Forgetting that in reality, if you want your samples to really have this unique and really powerful professional sound, you're going to want to tailor your samples so that they're somewhat realistic in the vein of what you're sampling for. So, great example. I'm going to sample a snare drum. Okay, well, if I just take a singular mic and I put it where I would normally mic the snare drum by itself, although I will get a snare drum sample, that snare drum sample will not be very impressive. Why? Because when a normal drummer sets up his drum set, and we're recording it in the studio, the snare mic isn't the only mic that captures the snare. And so the snare sound is actually a combination of the snare mic. It could be a snare bottom mic as well as a little bit of bleed from the surrounding microphones, but definitely there is a touch of overhead that's in there, so you're looking at maybe being 3 to 4 feet away from the snare. And then of course there's usually a room, and there may be stereo room mics that may be as far as 10 to 15 feet away. And so capturing that snare to get that big sound means that you should really be miking that snare as if it was part of a setup in order to get that very impressive, realistic kind of tone. Now, of course, you could always morph it and add reverb or compress it and get more of the decay sound out of it. There's a lot of manipulation you can do after the fact. But I think it really comes down to choosing your locations for sampling better and monitoring your samples very closely, and really kind of getting that stylistic sample, because that's what people pay for. When you're looking at why would people buy the instrument packages over my packages? Well, one, they already come with a user interface, so they build this whole software platform where each one of their sample devices has its own user interface that people can very uniquely adjust and change. And I think that's half the battle. But on the other side of that, they literally sit in the studio with professional engineers capturing really quality sounds all day, and they experiment and they try different things, and they really try to push the limit and the boundaries of what the samples sound like. So you're looking for that. So at the very beginning of the process, you want to be capturing awesome samples in unique locations, and you want to make sure that you have this overall sound so that it's nice and full. You want to have strong levels, so the normalization process is going to be part of the post work on your samples. So you will actually typically want to normalize after you cut up your samples. So you'll cut up your samples and normalize them one by one. And there's a couple of different processes for this. You can check out our YouTube clip about that. But there's a different technique to that as opposed to the actual capture. So when you're capturing, you just really need strong samples. Just remember that the sampling engine is going to dictate the velocities. So once you plug it into the sampling engine, you try to play it on a pad or on your keyboard. You play lighter, it'll play back lighter. You play it harder, it'll play back louder. And it'll do that automatically. So what you don't want is in your samples, you don't want this huge variance of dynamic volume between them. So let's say I went and I sampled a kick drum and then I sample a snare. I want those volumes between the two of them to be pretty even. So by normalizing those samples, you're really going to get that. In addition to that, like once you've cut those up, I think the bigger thing that I see, because I really work with a lot of samples, I think the bigger thing that I see that's like the biggest headache is sorting samples. And so finding an easy way to, okay, I have all my samples, let's say I have 1,000 samples that I just made today. I have to actually take the time and manage those files. I need to set them in folders, on my computer system, and make sure that they are sorted by type. They may even need to be sorted by strike. Like I just did a recent set of samples, and it was snare drum. And what I was trying to do with my snare drum samples is I was basically taking the snare drum, and I didn't want a right hand hit for all of my samples. What I wanted is an alternating right, left, but I wanted the first right strike to have one sound, the first left strike to have one sound, the second right strike to have another sound, and the second left strike to have another sound, so that if I wanted to just generate a roll, it really felt very natural, and it felt like it was utilizing alternating hands. So in order to do that, I actually had to go in and set out, like when I'm exporting my files, when I'm cutting up the sampling, I have to go in and label them. This is snare drum right hit 1, snare drum right hit 2, snare drum left hit 1, snare drum left hit 2, and I have to keep those sorted, because it's very easy to, in the process, because there's so much going on and there'll be so many files to have to work with, to really get confused and to make it very hard for you to load them into your engine. I think once you have them figured out and you know which files are which, loading them into your sampling engine is not very difficult, because then you know where they are and then you know what sounds you're actually looking for and what to expect. Now, the big thing about loading them into a sampling engine is you're going to be required to do two different things when you load your samples into a sampling engine. So what I like to do is I like to sample in Pro Tools, and I like to use Reason for my sampling engine. I use the NNXT a lot of times for anything that I'm going to put on a keyboard that'll be melodic, and I use the Kong for anything that's going to be rhythmic, like drums and things like that, or anything I may use that would be rhythmic. I did this whole shout patch one time, and I basically just stacked me shouting the word "hey" 16 times, and I put that on a Kong because I wanted it to be strikeable. I didn't want it to have to be played by a key, so it was part of the rhythmic element. So when we get into our sampling engine on Reason or any other device, we're going to be required to do two specific things. One, we have to tell the sample what its root note originally was. And if the sample is just a shout or something like that, we could easily just choose C3 and it'll be manipulated appropriately. If we were to know what that pitch was, though, and there was a pitch applied to the sample, meaning like we went in and we played a guitar and we played the note D, we need to know what octave we're in, and then we need to know what that note is, and we need to tell the sampler that is the root note for that sample. And what it'll do is it'll say, oh, okay, so I understand. So basically what the sampling engine is going to do is it's going to say, whenever someone actually plays on the keyboard the exact note and range that the original note came from, the sample will not be pitch adjusted. It'll literally play as it was, in the most authentic form. And then if anybody plays a higher note or a lower note, it'll be transposed by those higher notes and that by that much, and be accurately placed on the keyboard. So then when you play it, and with other musical items, it's actually on the right notes. So that's kind of one of the major things you have to do with that. The other thing is you have to set the key range. And when you're putting it on a keyboard like the NNXT in a sampling engine, something melodic, you have to choose which range of keys it's going to cover. Now, you could very simply just take, one note from every octave. Like, let's say we had the grand piano example. We take one note from every octave, and we could take each note and just say, hey, you know what? Each one note from each octave group is going to cover the whole key range of that octave, and our sampling engine will pitch adjust them accordingly. Well, what the example that I show on YouTube, we actually literally played every note on this grand piano, and we sampled every note, and then we loaded every note to its own note key zone according to the NNXT. So essentially we're loading them into the sampling engine saying, hey, C3 is C3 on this keyboard, C#3 is C#3 on this keyboard. So the sampling engine's literally spitting out like the exact pitch without any pitch adjustment. That essentially is the best way to do it. It takes some time, but that will show off essentially the highest quality level of your samples. Because when you sample them and you pitch adjust them, they really start to get a little warbly, and you kind of hear it a little bit. They don't sound as authentic. And then if you go too high up in the range, it sounds like the Chipmunks. You go too low down in the range, it sounds like some sort of beast thing. So it's kind of important to plan what ranges you're going to use. And then you can sample those notes and then map them directly to the key zones on the sampling engine itself. In addition to that, when you're looking at rhythmic stuff, I think the biggest thing that I see with the rhythms is when you're sampling stuff for rhythms, it's all about how much of a space is left when you cut those samples up between the starting time, the beginning of the waveform, and the actual strength or the height of the attack. And so trying to minimize that when you cut them up will really help your rhythms. And that's like the real difference between you sampling and when you go buy somebody's samples is technically most people, the majority of the manufacturers are going to cut their samples so the samples start at the strength of the attack, the highest peak of the attack on a rhythmic sample. And what that means is as soon as you hit that pad, there's no latency or delay between when you hit the pad and when the performance plays, the sample plays itself. And the downside to that is you don't get the front end of the development of the sound. The positive is it's completely in time. So I think it's one of those things that, when you're cutting up your samples, you have to keep that in mind, that you may actually not be able to start your sample when you cut it up at the beginning of the waveform, you may actually have to go to the height and the strength of where the strongest part of the attack is in order to make it play accurately. That's it for today. If you check out the YouTube channel, one of the beautiful things on there is the whole thing end to end, sampling the grand piano. It's really actually not that difficult. I think it's just part of understanding the process. We're using 2 different DAWs, but it's actually really exciting stuff, because when you have a sampling engine that you build on your own, you know, you can do whatever you want with it. You could sell it, you could resell it, you could sell it multiple times, you could share it. And of course, if you want to play it, you could just go play it. And one of the things that I like about it, I think that was a huge benefit, is I don't have a grand piano at home. So if I sample the grand piano in the studio and I cut it up and make that sampling engine so that I can play it at home, you know, then I can write from home and work on this grand piano and have it sound, I mean, it doesn't sound exactly like the grand piano, but it sounds very, very close. And it's more of a realistic performance than me just opening up some piano patch in my DAW. Anyway, that's it for today. We'll talk to you soon.
Be sure to check back for all new episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow our blog at manplusstudio.blogspot.com.